Today started just like yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that, and every day for the last month. A loop.
So I tried talking to the CMS and he could not explain any of the figures.
The computer system is faulty.
Child Maintenance Service has been awarded a liability order for a fictitious debt. There are many thousands of cases like this one.
They were taking illegally over 40% of my brother's wage, and he questioned, well, where's that money that I've paid?
The law states that once an assessment has been made by the CMS, it cannot be queried in a court of law.
Told Gavin he owes £15,000. They told the ex-wife that she's only going to get £7,555. Where is the other £8,000 going?
Your department took a decision deliberately to delete the records relating to the office before the National Audit Office had a chance to audit them.
Their mortality rate was actually over 14 times higher than the national rate. Wow, of death.
No one else has ever reported any problems.
As a government department funded by the taxpayer, public accountability.
When you become aware that a client of the service has taken their life, you carry out an investigation.
It's very much us looking at our own interaction with that parent's contact history.
1,013 excess deaths were happening in the paying parent population.
A media and political war on silence. Why is that, Hussein? Why?
Nobody seems to care. He was driven to where he was for money that he didn't owe.
The next big miscarriage of justice that up till now nobody has been talking about. Tell me more.
Next big one is the Child Maintenance Service. People are committing suicide now. I have a long list of people who committed suicide, including where the coroners have actually said this suicide, CMS played a part in. We have people sent to prison for money they don't know. We have the National Audit Office telling a parliamentary committee that yes, the CMS collects money that it's not owed.
Just take a listen, folks, to what the Director of Fraud and Proprietary at the National Audit Office, Joshua Redway, what he told the Department of Work and Pensions Select Committee just over a year ago in November 2022.
I received, as I suspect a number of us have, quite a few sort of angry emails. I'm forwarding you case details. The Child Maintenance Service has been awarded a liability order for a fictitious debt. There are many thousands of cases like this one. In your report, I noticed you put the figure of 99.35% on the accuracy of the child maintenance calculations. Are you satisfied that a large number of people saying that there is a fictitious debt are mistaken?
No, we're not satisfied with that. We wouldn't necessarily use the word fictitious. However, it does mean that people are being pursued for debts that there is not the evidence to substantiate that they owe.
Well, something doesn't look right, follow the money.
The errors, the misstatements. Now, I've got here the accounts for 2022 and 2023 about the Child Maintenance Service. It's quite extraordinary. There is what's called an adverse accounting opinion, which basically means it can't be signed off as a true and fair record. The aggregate total outstanding maintenance arrears balance is £196 million as at March 23. These balances are misstated as a result of a number of factors, most significantly due to errors in the historic underlying assessment calculations that makes further errors likely.
So actually it was inflated. It seems to be inflated by about 300%. The truth is actually those arrears are somewhat inflated because of the tools that we used, to 18 years ago. That's one. The second one is that when we have done some sampling into these to these arrears, we found that actually some of these payments have been made. Actually, no resident parent has paid.
I'm joined in the studio by two people who had family members who've tragically taken their own lives because of the pressures from these arrears from the Child Maintenance Service. Joe Smith and Ian Briggs. Joe, you lost your brother, Johnny, and Ian, you lost your son, Gavin. The circumstances, what happened?
He struggled for years with the Child Maintenance Service. You can see throughout his records, his transcripts that we were lucky enough to get hold of. I think where it all started to go wrong was when he changed from the Child Support Agency over to the Child Maintenance Service. Then, all of a sudden, I think it was £4,230 landed on his account that were arrears, which obviously then inflated his monthly payments. They were then retracted later down the line because the CMS said, oh, sorry, we put these on in error. They did 3 assessments in 1 year. One was based when he had a lot of overtime after he'd been furloughed, and then that kind of projected his income for the next 12 months, which was way higher than what he was actually on. They were taking illegally over 40% of my brother's wage, and he questioned, well, where's that money that I've paid? I'd like people to be able to challenge and get through to the CMS.
And up to the CMS barrister, and he referred the judge to the law itself. And the law states that once an assessment has been made by the CMS, it cannot be queried in a court of law.
Gavin he's actually had 2 failed marriages, so he's got 2 families that he's paying for. One of them was done through the court order, so he was paying for 2 kids through a court order of £269 a week. The CMS were going to take another £1,000 a month over and above that figure. And they had added another £26,000 to take his annual income up. He was a mechanic on the trains. You know, they don't earn that sort of money.
The system is almost designed to be psychological warfare.
And then there was also an arrears figure of £15,000. So I tried talking to the CMS, pulled Gavin's information up on his screen, and he could not explain any of the figures.
The computer system is faulty.
We were expecting to pay out £2,669 a month in child maintenance. Left him £153 a month to survive on. Wouldn't even pay for his petrol to go to work. How's he going to live? I subsequently found out with the arrears figures, told Gavin he owes £15,000. They told the ex-wife that she's only going to get £7,555. Where is the other £8,000 going to go?
Your department took a decision deliberately to meet conciliate to the office, wait for the National Audit Office and a chance to vote on. Why did you do that?
It was there, and absolutely this should not have happened, but it did happen because we had, we follow normal business case approach to retaining records. You should retain records for as long as you need them, and our standard approach across the department is where we can see no need to hold on to them, we destroy them after 14 months, and that didn't work with the cycle of the audit. So that's 2 things that didn't work together.
No one else has ever reported any problems.
As government department funded by the taxpayer, public accountability is going to be very high up on your list of reasons why you might need to keep something. Why did nobody in your department realise that information about the finances of the department couldn't be destroyed until at the very least the accounts had been signed off?
It's my MP, nothing he could do about it. It's general data
Who is your MP? Can you say who your MP is?
Yeah, Marcus Fish. I thought, well, I need some legal help here, so I went to 4 different solicitors. None of them would touch it. None of them were interested. Nobody wanted to take my money. So I've written to Arlene Sugden.
When you become aware that a client of the services has taken their life, you carry out an investigation. What comes out of that? I mean, there's an investigation report, I suppose. What do you do with that? Does anything get published?
We very much just look at the case notes. A lot of the time, we've had no contact with that parent for quite some time. So what we're looking for is any involvement of ourselves that could have had an impact.
Your department took a decision deliberately to delete records relating to write-offs.
And if we think that's the case, then that's when we would refer it to the department's internal review process, but it's very much us looking at our own interaction with that parent's contact history.
Surely that should be an external review.
It's all brought to you because of general data protection laws. General data protection laws only apply to living personnel. They're hiding behind this general data protection law saying they can't talk to me. Nobody will take it on. They come back to me and say, we can't do anything until you go through the CMS complaints procedure. I can't go through the CMS complaints procedure because they won't talk to me. They're adamant they won't. It's horrendous what the CMS are doing. There are so many other people in the same boat as going with these false figures coming in. Nobody is interested. Nobody will do anything about it. That's the toughest bit that I found, is that nobody seems to care. Was driven to where he was for money that he didn't owe.
The CMS is a profit organisation. His father got a lot of evidence to prove that the CMS contributed to his son's death. However, the coroner refused to look at this evidence.
We had the head of the CMS, Noel Shanahan, saying that they inflated demands. And, people have vast quantities of documents to show they simply could never have owed what is being alleged. Sometimes these arrears, 20,000, 30,000. And sometimes money's been taken direct from bank accounts. And the biggest scandal of all is that they can't go into court and produce all the documents and say, right, this is what I earned, here are the HMRC receipts, blah, blah, blah. They can't do that because the law itself says that once a liability order has been issued, it cannot be challenged in a court of law. That is a scandal. Do away with that clause immediately.
And there remains a media and political war of silence. Why is that, you say? Why?
Hudson, who's done an extensive report into the connection between the child maintenance service and
it essentially ruined me financially, brought the business to its knees and wiped that out. It left me homeless and in a position where I would ultimately have to start over. And at the tail end of my journey through family court, a fraudulent claim was made against me, which the child maintenance service fully supported, put their whole weight behind. At that point I was on the verge of filing for bankruptcy, and they came after me with gusto.
The free and democratic country will conduct themselves so appallingly and seemingly delight in informing him that his pending bankruptcy would only temporarily protect him. It would use all their powers to enforce almost £20,000 of manufactured debt.
One particular phone call where it was pretty clear that I was on my knees seemed to take great pleasure in assuring me that when I come out of bankruptcy, they'd be there waiting and they would enforce this manufactured debt that had been created. It's become a barrier now to getting back on my feet because, having been made homeless once already, there's a real fear of becoming successful again because I know that it will kick off another round of the same. Those who have succumbed to suicide, too many stories where I've heard that, or what's ultimately led to that, is that the CMS have gone into their bank accounts unannounced and taken all their money. So they can't afford to pay their rent or their mortgage or put food on the table or clothe their kids.
I can really relate to this myself. The CMS or the CSA at the time in I think it was 2012, just reached into my account, took all my money. It meant that I wasn't able to buy food, it meant I wasn't able to travel to work, it meant that I wasn't going to be able to survive for the entire month.
You're making your forecasts and there would not have been enough to sustain a roof over my head were I to reach any kind of level of success, and unannounced the child maintenance service would go and take that.
The fees extortionate? Were they overinflated?
Well, they were based on my earnings from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, which had been wiped out. My ability to generate income had been wiped out. You can't magic it out of thin air. You certainly can't do that when you've been made homeless. It was black and white as far as they were concerned. I'd earned that before, therefore I must be able to earn it now. The circumstances around that money not being there, they weren't interested in, and I did take that to tribunal, and it transpired that they'd created some regulations that allowed them to ignore certain types of reasons that money was no longer there. It allows them to not take into consideration the conduct of the other party to the case that led to there being no money there, and they wanted to just enforce a debt that they had created based on historical income that it was clear to them was not achievable, and that money had essentially evaporated, and they were going to find a way to enforce it.
So you've filed this report. I don't know what your business was, but it's very extensive. So whatever you did before, you've used your skill set to compile the most comprehensive report. Can you tell people what you found in your report?
One of the things that leapt out at me when I started collating the data, I wanted answers. I wanted to find out if I was being individually persecuted or if it was a wider problem. Clearly it was a wider problem. There were lots of people complaining, but there was no real data, hard data to understand the scale and the depth of the problem. That led to lots of freedom of information requests asking for data, many of which were turned down. But ultimately, I managed to get hold of what I needed. When COVID hit us, it struck me that I could start running some calculations on what normal mortality rates would be. It's quite a large population that fall under the Child Maintenance Service, so we're getting towards 1 million people. As a cohort, I wanted to just compare the mortality rate amongst the paying parents and the mortality rate amongst the receiving parents. It was very quickly obvious that the receiving parents were actually slightly below what you would expect as a mortality rate nationally for those relevant age groups, and the paying parents were 4 or 5 times higher.
That is absolutely shocking. Unbelievable. They know this, they have this data, and yet they do not care about it. How is this happening in British society? How is it happening?
Rate you would expect. And I thought that was pretty alarming in itself. So that led me to dig deeper. And on digging deeper...
That is alarming.
Yeah. Well, it gets more alarming. So that paying parent population, I took that section of the population and I divided it into paying parents who don't have any arrears and paying parents who do have arrears. And that's essentially defined by those who are paying direct and those who have been moved on to collect and pay.
That period of investigative research resulted in a detailed 50-page report. Presentation is a summary and explanation of some of the key findings and an overview of what has happened since the report was published in June 2021. Data for the study was gathered from a series of Freedom of Information requests from the CMS quarterly statutory reporting from the Department of Work and Pensions, publicly available stat export database from the CMS online maintenance calculator, and other data sources such as the Office for National Statistics. Also the NHS and from the police, and also from a number of academic and think tank studies.
Those who have been moved on to collect and pay or deduction from their earnings. And what I found was in that smaller section of the population, their mortality rate was actually over 14 times higher than the national rate of death.
Wow.
So also was pretty compelling. And that led me to, divide that between males and females, mothers and fathers. We already heard, I think, that some 95-96% of paying parents are fathers, and the rest mothers. And I wanted to look at specifically how many people that is that are dying who otherwise wouldn't be. If they were in the rest of the population, they wouldn't be dying. That led me to calculate that on average over the 3-year period that I had data, 1,013 excess deaths were happening in the paying parent population.
The question remains, however, as to whether the CMS is a key causative factor in excess paying parent deaths. The CMS refused to release key data that would have enabled Brian Hudson to make a determination on this question. Their reasoning for this refusal was that it would breach the data protection. However, the departed have no protection under data protection legislation, so it was necessary to be creative, identifying a compelling indicator that these S have a key causative connection to the child maintenance service conduct.
Finished the report, of course, I sent it into all the key ministers,
including the Prime Minister and Minister responsible for suicide. A copy was also sent to every MP and every paper in the House of Lords. A copy was also sent to the Chief Executive of the highest profile mental health and suicide prevention charities, to the NHS leadership, to each of the mainstream news outlets, and of course to leadership of the child maintenance service themselves. In addition to this, the report has been circulated to members of many campaign groups, who in turn have sent copies of the report to the local MPs, senior ministers, and to the child maintenance service themselves again. 1 year later, and there remains a media and political wall of silence. Why is that, you say? On the 10th of January 2022, Simon Franklin of the Child Maintenance Service emailed Brian to ask for a copy of the study in connection with their independent review of how they support victims of domestic abuse. A copy was sent to him on the following day, on the 1st of June 2022. Brian wrote to Mr. Franklin to question why there had been no further communication despite almost 6 months passing since sending him the report. He highlighted that in that 6 months window there had been no dialogue with him or groups and organisations who support the affected parents. There have been no preventative measures to stem the alarming rate of mortality among paying parents, and in that time the CMS have actively pursued Parliament to further enforce powers that is already the strictest in the world, and they are aware it's causing such extreme levels of harm. Brian also highlighted the increase in the CMS's media activity in the world. Deadbeat dad narrative driven largely by press release issued by the CMS themselves, such as this from the Mirror, and this from the Sun, this from the Guardian, and this from the Mail, and this from the Express, and this from the Sun, which became the subject of an official complaint to the Independent Press Standards Organisation, who upheld the complaint, ruling that there was a failure to take care over the accuracy of claims being made, but that the inaccuracy was significant and was an accurate representation of the official statistics. In this email to Mr. Franklin, he went on to highlight that given the seriousness of the information contained in the study, and that it makes compelling links between the CMS conduct and the premature paying parent deaths, but the CMS have not invited any representatives of groups supporting parents to have a seat at the table.
And it's been a wall of silence from them so far.
Why is that, in your educated opinion?
I think it's something that they don't want to acknowledge. They've created this monster, such an enormous scandal.
Couldn't these excess deaths be something not attributed to the suicide because of CMS?
Funnily enough, COVID and lockdown produced another gift in terms of being able to identify a compelling correlation, and that is that CMS have a range of enforcement practices that they carry out. They're very active on enforcing against paying parents, and when they locked down, that enforcement activity reduced by, I calculated to be about 28%, and in that same period of time, the volume of parental deaths reduced by virtually the same amount. Clearly a connection between
black and white
child maintenance service enforcement activity and the rate at which parents will die.
Night and day, isn't it? Night and day. Yeah, we are a country that's supposed to be compassionate towards people, compassionate towards black, white, Hindu, male, female, supposedly all these other genders, but fathers, wow, absolute wow.
Well, immediately I completed the study, I sent copies into leading political parties, obviously into government and the opposition, to all the ministers. I then followed that up with actually sending a copy to every single MP. The House of Lords, most of the peers in the House of Lords, about 600 of them, have had a copy. Many hundreds of other people have also sent this document into Child Maintenance Service. I did have a reach out from the Child Maintenance Service to ask for a copy. Of course, I sent them a copy, and there's been nothing since.
Do you think they are worried?
Given the data that they refuse to release, and given the continued denial when they're asked the questions about this, their refusal to accept that there's any link, it suggests that they are locking down against it. And then if you also look at what's going on in the media, the continuation of the deadbeat dad narrative that's been in most of the mainstream press this year, some of that's been challenged with the Press Complaints Commission for the stories that they're publishing to be factually incorrect. Just wondering why you have an organisation that's been alerted to a very serious problem.
What they're doing is literally going to destroy society. It's going to implode and collapse.
Well, financially, the structure of CMS could never work. It could never have worked, and it never will work if you set it against what the cost of living is in terms of just being able to provide the very basics you need to live. The calculation they use can never work. When you take parents who have highly likely been through a traumatic breakup, may well have been through family court, family estate has been possibly raided by legal professionals, been under severe pressure already, it's really a recipe for disaster to approach enforcing child maintenance at that point on a deadbeat dad narrative where you're using a sledgehammer as a means to get revenue in.
Do these people, do they believe they're doing something good? I've seen in a bit of research some people involved have been given knighthoods because of their sterling work in the community to stop deadbeat dads.
I think that any reasonable and responsible person or entity, if alerted to something of this magnitude, would want to prove that it's not true. Before I try to prove it to the public, I would want to prove it to myself. So I would be looking at my own data, probably call in the people that are protesting and say to understand where they're coming from. Paying parents have no voice with the CMS, despite the fact that that's what's funding them. Their voice is completely silenced. If you're a responsible organisation, someone alerts you to this level of harm, the first thing you want to do is make sure that they're wrong. If I had been in their shoes, I would have invited me in to sit around a table with me and really get to grips with the study. I would open the books in terms of data so that I could help them to identify whether there is an actual causal relationship between those deaths to perpetuate the deadbeat dad narrative and the other myths around paying parents trying to evade responsibility. And that's not what we really want to portray because it's not the truth.
Right. Right. Thank you very much, sir.
Don't do this on your own. If it's against this evil CMS, which is tearing families apart, tearing fathers apart from their children, don't be on your own. Don't give up. There are plenty of people out there who are fighting this battle. We will win in the end.
Potential fraud offences. Prosecutions were not safe. That people had gone to jail wrongly. This is a state-owned company, and really there was no choice but to get some accountability and to make sure it can't happen again. Word on the politics of this, because that has blown up in an interesting way. But this was the moment when it was coming out into the open, and people in positions of power, this scandal sort of comes in two parts. There's potentially lying or not fulfilling their prosecutorial duties, and then there's people in positions of leadership and power who failed to ask the right questions. And it's worth reflecting that this isn't just taking people to court and giving them a rap on the knuckles or a bit of a fine. People serve prison sentences. Some people even took their own lives after this ordeal. When we then get this public inquiry,
tough being a man, isn't it? Pursued by the child maintenance service for money that you haven't got, and quite often for money that you don't even owe. Unable to see your own children, the courts completely ineffective when it comes to imposing their own orders. if the ex-partner doesn't want the man to see his own children.